Hello, good afternoon. I'm Professor Philip Howard, Chair of the Department of History. And on behalf of the members of the department, I wish to welcome you to Dr. Jerry Cadava's lecture on the Hispanic Republican in Historical Perspective. I would like to thank Dr. Cadava for his time agreeing to share his scholarly expertise on this subject. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Monica Perales and Dr. Nancy Young of the Center for Public History for their support and for inviting Dr. Cadava and participating in this event itself. Finally, I wish to thank Dr. Kirk Watson, the Dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs, for hosting and arranging matters to make this lecture possible. We are greatly appreciative of his time, generosity, and support. And with that said, I will now turn the program over to Dr. Watson.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. I appreciate that introduction. And I want to echo, by the way, my name is Kirk Watson. I'm the founding dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs. And one of the things we want to do at the Hobby School of Public Affairs is be plugged into all sorts of public policy discussions in Houston, in Texas, and in the country, and internationally as well. So it's really great, and I want to reiterate what Dr. Howard said, a thanks to the Center for Public History and Monica Perales. I also want to thank from the Hobby School of Public Affairs, Professor Pablo Pinto, who plays such an integral role for helping coordinate all of this. And I'm very appreciative. Let me tell everybody what we're going to do, and then I'll introduce our two stars that are our panelists that we're going to hear from today. We're going to have a discussion, as Dr. Howard pointed out, of the Hispanic Republican in historical perspective. We were going to start with a presentation by Dr. Geraldo Cadava from Northwestern University, and I'm going to introduce him in more detail in just a second after I walk through the logistics. Following his discussion, we will then have comments and a discussion by Dr. Nancy Beck Young of the University of Houston Department of History. And then after that, I'm going to facilitate a discussion with Dr. Cadava and Dr. Young, where we talk about some of these issues. If you're watching this thing, you're in a position where you can ask some questions too. In fact, as we get toward the end of this, we're going to just pause, and I'm going to run through some of the questions. But don't hesitate to go to the chat feature and talk to us, ask us questions, and I'll do my best as we go along to try to work some of those questions from the audience into what we're doing here. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. Dr. Geraldo Cadava is a political commentator and an associate professor of Latina and Latino studies at Northwestern University. He received his PhD from Yale University, and he has taught courses in Latina and Latino history. He's also taught courses in the 2016 election, and as I understand it, he's even taught courses on the musical Hamilton. So we may even have some questions about that. His second book is called The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump. And in that book, he details how Republican Latinos have arrived at their politics throughout history. And he's broadly sought to speak on this topic. And it's a topic that's at the top of mind of a lot of folks that follow public policy and politics. After he speaks, we're going to hear, as I indicated, from Dr. Nancy Beck Young, who is a professor in the University of Houston Department of History, as well as being the associate director of the University of Houston Center for Public History. She earned her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, and she was awarded the 2020 Moores Professorship, which is a distinct honor at the University of Houston. She received that for her outstanding research and dedication to the preservation of historical education. Her research questions how ideology has shaped public policy and political institutions, She's written a number of historical books, including one on Wright Patman and others. She is in the process of writing a book on Cactus Jack Garner, John Nance Garner, the Vice President of the United States under Roosevelt, under Franklin Roosevelt, from Uvalde, Texas. So we've got two great people to talk to us. So with that, I'm going to turn over for a discussion. We're going to hear first from Dr. Cadava. And Doctor, let me just say, welcome to the University of Houston, virtually. And thank you for being with us. And the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And I want to thank all of you for putting together this event. I want to thank Professor Young for taking the time to engage my work and have this conversation. I want to thank Dean Watson too for moderating, and the Hobby School of Public Affairs, the Department of History, the Center for Public History, my friend Monica Perales for extending this invitation and doing a lot of the initial groundwork, and then even all of my other friends and acquaintances at the University of Houston, especially in the Department of History. Even if I don't see you here on the screen, it's nice to know that you're out there. And I, of course, wish that I were there talking with you in person, and that we had the chance to do some socializing afterwards. I don't think I've been to the University of Houston since Raul Ramos and Luis Alvarez hosted me more than a decade ago. So, I look forward to the time when we can get out and move around the country again so I can stop by Houston again. So thank you. Thank you really for having me. It means a lot to me. So I know that I am talking about my book, but I really do see the book just as a jumping off point for our conversation about a lot of other things related to American politics, past and present. So I'll try to be as brief as I can. I think what I'm going to do is just kind of offer an overview of what's inside of my book, and I'll talk mainly, I guess, about the history in this portion of things, and then hopefully we can unpack a little bit about what the history itself means for the present and even the future going forward. In general, I study Latino politics and the Hispanic Republican movement over the past 70 years or so. My book, I have a copy right here, covers the period mainly from the Nixon years forward, although there are a couple chapters at the beginning that wind the clock back to the Eisenhower years as well. The way the book is structured, it has 4 parts, and they kind of follow the arc of the Hispanic Republican movement. The first is called Awakening, a kind of early nascent period when Latinos are starting to move toward the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is starting to move toward Latinos, but it hadn't really coalesced into a fully formed movement at that time. That didn't really happen until the Nixon years, and it was during the Nixon years, the Ford years, the Reagan years that Latino Republicans started to feel much more included within the Republican Party, and that second section of my book is called Inclusion. The third part is called Doubt, because this is a moment primarily during the Reagan years and the George H.W. Bush years where they're feeling simultaneously more included in the Republican Party, but also wary and doubtful that the Republican Party truly represented them. And they felt uncertain about their place in the Republican Party's coalition. And the final section I've called Loyalty, because it's a period when the Republican Party was moving further to the right on issues like border control and immigration. And it's not that, I'll just say that the Hispanic Republicans felt that they were at greater pains to justify their continued support for the Republican Party as the Republican Party moved further to the right on these issues. It's not that they abandoned the Republican Party, they still have not abandoned the Republican Party, but they increasingly doubted their place in it and continued to cast their votes for Republicans out of a sense of partisan loyalty that they had developed over the course of decades. So first, quickly, I became interested in this book, not necessarily because I wanted it to have an impact on topics related to present day politics. I actually got interested in this topic because my grandfather is a Hispanic Republican. He's a Colombian and Panameño, and he became a US citizen by joining the US military, and he retired from the military in Tucson, Arizona, and then held jobs as a dishwasher at a country club and worked in a silver mine outside of Tucson, Arizona. And he voted for a Republican for the first time in 1980 when he voted for Ronald Reagan, for the very narrow reason that Reagan was promising to put more money back into his biweekly paychecks in the form of tax cuts. But then over the subsequent decades into the present, now he's 95 as of last week, and he has embraced every position of the Republican Party wholesale. So it started with taxes, but then it also became about welfare, border control, immigration, foreign policy, everything. And so part of what I was interested in is how someone's political views evolve over time and how they might join a movement for a very particular reason, but then over a period of decades become loyal partisans. And he and I argued about politics, ever since I started caring about politics in the late 80s and early 90s. And we were talking about, Proposition 187 and border walls and things like that. And so our kind of conversation about politics evolved over time. And in many ways, I'm sure that this book is still, part of my ongoing conversation with my grandfather about Latino politics, even though we don't really argue about politics anymore. He did vote in 2016 for Donald Trump. He is in a nursing home, in a VA home in Tucson, Arizona. He did not vote in 2020 because he was having a hard time interpreting mail-in ballots and things like that. So I think, politics in some ways for him has faded into the background a little bit, but for me, our conversation still really resonated. That's why I got interested in it. I also, as a Latino historian, I was thinking about what this topic does for studies of Latino history. And, I think it's a kind of uncomfortable topic for many Latino historians and Latino studies faculty who've been concerned with more liberal movements for social justice and immigrant rights. And there's still an idea out there that Latino Republicans are sellouts or race traitors or pochos, kind of traitors to their race. And, to be confronted with members of your own community who don't share your politics, it can be a kind of uncomfortable act. And even if we kind of have, family members whose politics we don't agree with, that isn't always a comfortable thing either. So in some ways, I wanted to really foreground this conversation that I think is still nevertheless an important part of Latino identity, Latino history, and things that we should wrestle with. And so in some ways, it was an effort to kind of push the field beyond where it had been. So that's all I'll say about where I was coming from. And now I'll just narrate some things about how I see the Hispanic Republican movement having shifted over the past several decades. So the first Republican candidate that Hispanic Republicans rallied around was Dwight Eisenhower in 1952. And by and large, there was a Latinos con Eisenhower group that formed in Southern California. They tried to start, small relationships, building relationships with individuals in Texas, but it was really a Southwestern regional movement. A lot of Dwight Eisenhower's Hispanic support came from World War II veterans who saw Dwight Eisenhower as the kind of leader that the United States needed in the early years of the Cold War. One of his most prominent supporters was a San Antonio, a man who became a San Antonio advertising executive named Leonel Sosa, who ended up being a Republican for many, many decades and worked for Reagan and many other Republicans. So, and he traces his kind of evolution as a Republican back to the Eisenhower years. Even though he wasn't old enough to vote at that time, this is the moment when he recognized that he identified with the Republican Party. Then, and the important thing I think to note about Eisenhower, of course, is that it precedes by a number of years the more famous Viva Kennedy movement that coalesced around JFK's candidacy. And we often point to that movement as one of the early moments of Latino participation in electoral politics in the first presidential campaign to really reach out to Latinos. But Eisenhower did it as well. The guy who was really at the core of this is a man named John Garcia from California, who really tried to ramp up this Latinos con Eisenhower group. Then there was Barry Goldwater, who kind of touted his Western roots and said that he was practically born on the US-Mexico border. That's an exaggeration by 100 miles or so. He was born further north. And he said that he, as a kid, spoke Spanish practically as well as he spoke English. Again, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but he still kind of pronounced his Western roots. He was also an important part of his '64 campaign was railing against JFK's failures at the Bay of Pigs. And so he had a whole, anti-communist bent that appealed to Cubans who in South Florida in the 1960s were still largely an exile community. They hadn't really kind of fully become involved in American partisan politics, but he began to establish connections. And he had the support of a guy named Fernando Penabas, who was a Cuban exile and actually went to Duke University, but then went back to the island and worked as a lawyer for a while, then came back to Florida. And Fernando Penabas was the kind of head of the Goldwater campaign in the Southeast. And he, really tried to build ties between Goldwater as a candidate, the Cuban community in Florida, and the Republican Party broadly. One thing that's worth noting, I think, and I think I gestured toward it when I said that at this time the Cuban community was still largely an exile community. Cubans didn't really get fully involved in American partisan politics until later in the 1970s, and they were really brought into the Republican Party in 1980 under Reagan. And I remember interviewing one Mexican American from California who had served in the Ford administration, who said that Cubans didn't really get involved until they didn't really matter until 1980, until Reagan came around. And so I think that it's an interesting window into this tension between who started the Hispanic Republican movement, Mexican Americans in the Southwest. I think today we think that the original Latino conservatives are the Cubans in Florida, but that's not the case at all. The movement actually started in the Southwest, and I think that's interesting too. But I digress. That's just a kind of point about the interethnic tensions between Cubans and Mexican Americans and how they understand their influence within the Republican movement. But the important thing to note about Eisenhower and Goldwater is that the Hispanic Republican movement in the 50s and 60s really was just this kind of nascent, fragmented movement of small groups of Latinos in particular places like California and Texas and Florida. They had no kind of national coordination. They hadn't come together to at all articulate what the core characteristics were of Hispanic Republican identity. There was anti-communism, it was the Cold War, there was a general support for capitalism, things like that, but there wasn't a full-throated articulation of Hispanic Republican identity. It was also largely just a kind of oppositional identity articulated in opposition to Democrats. And part of the idea was that during the New Deal, Latinos had become loyal Democrats, loyal to FDR, whose New Deal policies really helped them out in a time of need, and they became loyal Democrats. But Hispanic Republicans in the 1950s began to ask, well, what have you gotten for all of your loyalty to the Democratic Party? They only come around every 4 years looking for your votes at election time, but then they ignore you. I think this rhetoric probably still sounds a little bit familiar today even, but in many ways, the early articulation of a Hispanic Republican identity was just an opposition to the Democratic Party, which many Hispanics thought took them for granted. Democrats had taken Hispanics for granted. So this is just this early moment. Things didn't really start to come together during the first Nixon administration. And there's a lot going on. I think, in the late 1960s, by the late 1960s, the Republican Party recognizes that African Americans are leaving the Republican Party in droves, and they know, they very explicitly articulate that they need to make up for the lost support among African Americans by finding new groups of voters, and Latinos are some of the prime targets for them. But Nixon also kind of has this Western president narrative, much like Barry Goldwater did. There's a whole kind of Bildungsroman about his own, political formation, that he grew up in near the fields of southeastern Los Angeles, near Whittier, California, and he practically worked alongside Mexican-American agricultural laborers, and he got to know them and their customs and understood them to be deeply faithful, hard workers, things like that. And when he goes to Washington, he kind of carries on LBJ's Interagency Committee on Mexican-American Affairs. This is a kind of interagency committee, and by that I just mean the agencies, the federal agencies that work most with quote unquote Latino issues, and they were considered to be like health, education, and welfare, and housing and urban development, and the FDA, and all these other groups. And the heads of those agencies met together to talk about Latino issues, and there was a kind of Latino head of them that coordinated their meetings. And under LBJ, it was called the Interagency Committee on Mexican-American Affairs, but Richard Nixon changed the name of that group and its mission to be the Cabinet Committee on Opportunities for Spanish-Speaking People. And it had 9 members, and the members were supposed to be proportionally distributed by, depending on how large a particular Latino population was. So there were supposed to be 4 Mexicans, 3 Cubans, 2 Puerto Ricans. And it was the first attempt by the federal government to bring together these different national groups. And I think Nixon's strategy was based primarily on politics of patronage and capitalism as a kind of third prong of the civil rights movement, in addition to marching for social and political equality. So Nixon said this. So in terms of patronage, what I mean by that is high-level appointments in the White House, in the Nixon administration, and also the creation of federal jobs across the United States that specifically targeted Latinos. And in fact, in an interview with the Latina conservative Linda Chavez, she said that the reason she didn't like Richard Nixon is that he was the father of the quota system. He kind of birthed affirmative action for Latinos before it was a thing by allocating certain percentages of federal jobs in particular regions according to how big the Latino population was in a particular area. That was a kind of affirmative action. And so as a conservative, she didn't like that in the 70s, she said. But then also these appointments. So Nixon was the first president to appoint the first Hispanic treasurer of the United States, a woman named Romana Acosta Bañuelos. She was the owner of a tortilla factory and a Mexican food distribution company called Ramona's Mexican Food Products. Even though her name was Romana, she said she called it Ramona's because she thought that white people would have a hard time pronouncing Romana. And then she also started the Pan American National Bank. So she was kind of this unicorn for Richard Nixon, where she was a businesswoman. She represented this idea that women could succeed in the world of business and politics. She created scholarships for Mexican-American students at UCLA. She considered herself to be a feminist in the sense that she believed that women could have successful careers, but she was not a radical Chicana feminist, and she was not in any way an activist. And so she was kind of this perfect symbol for Richard Nixon. And then, we know that within the Republican Party, it became a kind of tradition to appoint Hispanic women to the post of Treasurer of the United States. After Bañuelos, there was Catherine Ortega under Reagan, Catalina Vázquez Villalpando, Kathy Villalpando during the Bush years. There was Rosario Marin under George W. Bush. So it's become a kind of tradition to appoint Hispanic women to the post of Treasurer of the United States. But Nixon did a lot of other things too, like appointed or he created an agency called the National Economic Development Association, and he appointed as the head of that a guy named Benjamin Fernandez. He appointed Philip Sanchez to be the head of the Small Business Administration, and also created the Office of Minority Business Enterprise. So as a result of all of this stuff, Nixon's support among Hispanics increased from single digits in 1968 to some 33, 34% in 1972. And he became the first Republican president to win about a third of the Latino vote, which kind of has become the bar for most Republican presidential candidates. And, you know, even outliers like Gerald Ford or Bob Dole, who didn't do as well as most other Republicans, they still did better than any Republican before Richard Nixon in 1972. So Nixon kind of set a new bar. I think the biggest shift, I'm not going to focus too much on Gerald Ford. I mean, there's a lot to say about it. I think the most important thing that happened under Gerald Ford is, you know, a couple things. He passed the extension, the 1975 extension to the Voting Rights Act. He also, under his watch, and in coordination with the RNC, which at the time was headed by George H.W. Bush, helped create the Republican National Hispanic Assembly in the mid-1970s. And this became a kind of bullpen for the Republican Party to appoint Hispanics to administration posts. I think that was really the most important legacy of the Ford years. But I want to get to Reagan and the rest, because I think there's a lot that happens then. I think the major innovation of the Reagan years is that Reagan kind of turns away from the patronage politics of the Nixon years and says that he's going to wage a much more ideological campaign in his effort to recruit Latinos. So he has some key Hispanic campaign advisors, including Leonel Sosa, who I was telling you about. By this point in 1978, Leonel Sosa is the head of his own PR firm called, what is it called? There's Yardang and Associates, but then I think he starts his own company. He had recently run the campaign for Texas Senator John Tower, and John Tower, in fact, introduced Leonel Sosa to Reagan. And it was to Leonel Sosa that Reagan famously said, you know, Leonel, you're going to have the easiest job ever because Hispanics are Republicans who just don't know it yet. And I think a lot of people have probably heard that line, and that's, you know, Leonel Sosa's role in that history. So Leonel Sosa was one of his Hispanic campaign officials, and there were other advertising executives too, named Fernando Oaxaca and Alex Armendariz. They owned their own PR firms in California, and they really crafted a national Hispanic campaign for Reagan. And Reagan ran the first Hispanic campaign to put up kind of television ads across the country and run radio ads across the country targeting Hispanics. And it was his Hispanic campaign officials that really settled on this core set of characteristics that defined the Hispanic Republican. And you can almost imagine these Hispanic campaign officials sitting together in a room and kind of articulating, well, what is it that brings Hispanic Republicans together? How is being a Hispanic Republican any different than being any other kind of Republican? And, you know, in some way, this is the argument that all Latinos have always had with each other. You know, the fundamental argument among Latinos is what are the things that bring us together? What are the things that make us different? I mean, in some ways, the main characteristic of Latino identity at all is an ongoing conversation about what it means to be Latino. And this is what Reagan's Hispanic campaign officials are doing in the late 1970s. And they settle on things that are probably pretty familiar to you, you know, the family values, the work ethic, support for capitalism, anti-communism, these kinds of things. And in many ways, this is still the same playbook that the Republican Party is running with Hispanics, even today, even the Trump campaign. I mean, I think in many ways, the Hispanics for Trump, the Latinos for Trump campaign is the most traditional and predictable aspect of Latinos, of the Trump campaign. You know, I mean, it's the same kind of playbook basically that Republicans were running in 1980. So Reagan shifted from this kind of politics of patronage to this much more ideological based appeal. And I can unpack that a little more for you guys later on, but that's the main shift to note. There's a lot going on during the Reagan years. I mean, there's the foundation of the Cuban American National Foundation, and Reagan develops a close friendship with Jorge Mascanosa, and that kind of brings Cubans into the fold. There's the Immigration Reform and Control Act, with which Hispanic Republicans have lots of feelings about. And then there's also the Contra War, and Hispanic Republicans by and large support the president's interventionist politics in Central America. And then, so these are the kind of characteristics. This is the doubt of the Reagan period. They're simultaneously included, but there is a lot going on in the Republican Party beginning in the late 1970s that's gaining momentum, that starts to cast a shadow of doubt in the minds of many Republicans about how truly included they are. And I would point to the establishment of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, which was kind of a zero population growth group, and also a spinoff called US English. And this is this group that tried to pass a constitutional amendment to make English the official language of the United States. And an interesting kind of sidebar to her history, Linda Chavez is the president of US English for a period in the 1980s, and she claims to have not known about the eugenicist roots of its founders, but this puts her in a kind of tough position. So I want to focus in the last few minutes on the period from the 90s forward, because in many ways, I think we're still kind of living in the moment defined by the politics that starts to build in the 1990s. And part of what is central to this rise of groups within the Republican Party, like the Federation for American Immigration Reform, the US English, is the rise of a kind of nativist and xenophobic politics that comes to be represented by the early 1990s by a figure like Pat Buchanan, who in 1992 poses a pretty significant primary challenge to George H.W. Bush. He wins something like 37 or 40% of all Republican primary voters, which gives him a pretty big say in what happens with the Republican Party platform in 1992. So a kind of fight breaks out at the 1992 Republican National Convention over the inclusion of this word structures in the platform when it talks about border controls, and a whole debate ensues among Hispanic Republicans about what's meant by the word structures. Did he really mean a border wall? That's what many Hispanic Republicans feared. And some of his defenders said, oh, he didn't really mean that. He was talking about like updating the technologies and giving border patrol officers all the support they needed. And Buchanan himself said, like, no, I meant a border wall. That's what we're going to do. We're going to build a border wall down there. And this is the beginning of a lot of the Republican Party's move to the right on immigration. And we see it in Proposition 187 in California, that the politics in that state spread around the country. We see it in Bill Clinton's signing. Bill Clinton signed it as a Democratic president, but it was a bill really championed by Newt Gingrich's Republican-led Congress, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. I have to slow down whenever I say that because it's a mouthful, but that bill imposed a lot of new restrictions on immigrants. It kind of stripped a lot of benefits for even legal immigrants. It established the 287G program, which allowed cooperation between local authorities and the Border Patrol. And that was seen as, a really definitive moment in the Republican Party's history. And, they were kind of taking a stand as the party of immigration restriction. And that's why by 2000, when George W. Bush became the nominee, many Hispanic Republicans saw his nomination as a pull back from the brink of the insanity defined by the party's rightward shift as seen through things like Prop 187 and ERIRA. You know, Bush, as I'm sure you all know, had this reputation as being a compassionate conservative, and he had more moderate immigration policies. He, as the governor of Texas, had appointed a whole bunch of Mexican Americans to his administration, including Alberto Gonzalez as the head of the Supreme Court, who had become his attorney general in the White House. And so, you know, many Hispanic Republicans wanted to believe that George W. Bush really defined the future of the Republican Party when it came to Hispanic outreach. And it was based on a theory that the way to reach Hispanics was by crafting comprehensive immigration reform. And, you know, it's kind of become famous to talk now about how in his first few months of his presidency, he was working on a comprehensive reform bill with his Mexican counterpart, Vicente Fox, that kind of got blown up with, I'm sorry, that is a terrible analogy to use, but I didn't even mean to say it, but with 9/11, that just stopped all of the momentum that Fox and Bush had built working toward comprehensive immigration reform. And then it went nowhere after that. I think in retrospect now from 2020, we can see those 8 years of the George W. Bush administration as a kind of blip on the radar screen, a kind of 8-year period when Hispanics felt themselves to be really included in the Republican Party in the broader context of this 30-year period of exclusion as the party's moving farther to the right. And that's why after, you know, Mitt Romney lost in 2012, the party authored this Growth and Opportunity Project, the so-called autopsy report. And that's why, you know, and that, by the way, it was just, in case you don't know, I'm sure most of you do, but the Growth and Opportunity report kind of committed to doing a better job to recruit Latinos and other minorities. It was a kind of vision for a big tent Republican Party. Because Mitt Romney's loss had been particularly painful, and the idea within the Republican Party, including by people like George W. Bush, the former president, but also Reince Priebus, the head of the RNC, was that the Republican Party was going to die if it didn't do more to reach out to Latinos and other minority groups, and women and natives and Asian Americans and others. So that's why I think it made all the sense in the world that in 2016, someone like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio would be the front runners heading into 2016. But we now know that beneath the surface had been bubbling a lot of the same forces that were represented by people like Pat Buchanan, that had been bubbling for decades. And that's what took the party over in 2016 and led to Trump's presidency. I do think we're still in that moment, but I think, you know, we'll talk about this in the discussion. I think Trump presents us with a lot of interesting things to talk about because, you know, somehow this president who had began his president by talking about Mexican immigrants and chants of build the wall, in fact, expanded his support among Latinos. And I think, you know, there's a lot to say there, and hopefully we'll talk about it. I think just to note some things, you know, my book focuses mainly on the Republican Party apparatus over the past 40 or 50 years. There are a lot of like people who would today, I think, be considered like the moderate Republicans, you know, these kind of older, distinguished gentlemen who, by and large, are really disappointed with the direction of the Republican Party and don't like Donald Trump at all. But not all of them abandoned the Republican Party. Some still voted for Republicans, but they increasingly questioned their support for the Republican Party in its current form. So I think one of the questions to ask is, well, how is it that Trump is actually expanding his support? And who is he bringing into the party? What forces has he activated among Latinos and even Latino youth who support him? And even, you know, with all of his law and order rhetoric, Border Patrol officers, police officials. So I think, you know, we're going to be doing a lot of thinking and talking and arguing about what, you know, Donald Trump's presidency meant for a long time. And I think, you know, just one of the things we'll be talking about is what the current and future status of Hispanic Republicans is. And hopefully we can get into some of that now. So I think I went a couple minutes over. I'm sorry about that. That's my overview.
It's fascinating. Yeah, no problem. That's why we're here, is we want to hear from you. So that's great. Thank you for kind of setting the table for us. Dr. Young, I'm going to turn to you and ask you now to give us a little bit of a discussion. And then at that point, I'll start asking some questions, and we'll try to have a moderated discussion as best I'm capable. But I want to remind everybody that's watching, if you want, go to the Q&A, go to the chat room, and feel free to post your questions, and we will try to get to those questions as part of this. So Dr. Young, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you everyone who has made this event possible. And let me say to Dr. Cadava that I really, really, really loved your book. I think it is fabulous. And so you are to be congratulated for writing such a wonderful book. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks pretty brief so that we have time for a robust discussion. I think that's what everyone wants. I'm going to start with a quick observation that I had not intended to make, and then I'm going to tell a brief micro story, and then I am going to spend the bulk of my time talking about the macro issues as I see them in American political history from about the 1960s forward. So first, the brief observation. I was living in Illinois during the George W. Bush presidency and teaching at a small liberal arts college in Southern Illinois. And I'll never forget reading in the New York Times about then Governor Bush's push to make sure that undocumented kids had an opportunity to get public higher education in Texas at in-state tuition rates. And I just remember going, what? Bush did what? And just being really rather surprised by it all. So you're talking about his record brought that up for me. So that was my very quick observation. And if you have more to say or more thoughts on that, I would certainly be interested in them. Now I'd like to take just a minute or two longer to tell the story of one Hispanic, now Republican woman who follows the trajectory of the story of your book. This is a woman I've come across in research for a digital humanities project I'm undertaking with a colleague of mine in the history department, Dr. Leandra Zarno. And there's a woman by the name of Cynthia Bibon, who was from Brownsville, Texas in 1977. And she was well-educated. She was a school teacher and had other related careers over the course of her professional life, and ultimately earned a doctoral degree. And in the 1970s, she was very involved in what we would call in the women's movement. She was a delegate to the National Women's Conference, which was held here in Houston in 1977. She was on one of the commissions on the local level commissions on the status of women. She was a Texas delegate to the Democratic National Convention in 1980. So sounds pretty much like a pretty liberal Democrat so far, right? Involved with feminist issues and delegate to the Democratic National Convention in 1980, which was not an easy year to be a Democrat, right? Not an easy year at all. She was very much a joiner. She was involved in just about every local organization you can imagine, including the Hidalgo County Coin Club. This woman was involved in just about everything. And the thing that surprised me in trying to compile her demographic history was that by the early 21st century, she was a member of the Republican Party. So something happened. Something happened. What exactly happened, I don't know. But I offer the story of this one woman as an example of what you're talking about in this book, as a suggestion to anyone who is out there listening, wondering about a dissertation topic. There is so much more that can be done on the problems that Dr. Cadava researches in this book. There are there's just so much more work to be done. And I'd also challenge someone to write a book and I don't think you could flip the title, right? I don't think the Hispanic Democrat would work for reasons that you lay out in your book. But somebody also needs to write a parallel book so I can have one sitting right beside it on my shelf about Latinx involvement in the Democratic Party. I think that that is also work that is very much needed. So what I would like to do for the remainder of my time is just offer a few thoughts that are at the very macro level, what is happening with regard to what is happening in American politics from the era of Lyndon Johnson to the present. And yeah, I can do this in 5 or 6 minutes, I promise. So I'll start with the question that Democrats asked. Did Lyndon Johnson overreach? I mean, what happened, for goodness gracious? He won by the largest majority to date in history, depending upon how you want to count it, in 1964. He won just about every demographic possible, with the exception of racist Southern white voters. I mean, really, that was about all that didn't vote for him, and Goldwater's home state. So it was a landslide. So what happened? Democrats were looking forward to an extension of the New Deal order for another 30 years or so, with follow through with what Johnson pushed through Congress in 1965 and on. So what happened to the Democratic Party? Many books have been written about this. Many more books will be written about this, and people are still trying to figure that out. Was there some overreach?
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh, Siri, we don't need you. Apologies for Siri on my watch. She appears at the most inopportune moments. So was there overreach? Probably some overreach. More importantly, the Vietnam War derails Johnson's spending on domestic reform, making it impossible to continue the sort of liberal reform. We move into the 1970s with Richard Nixon. We have Watergate. And so between Vietnam and Watergate, the political stasis in the country is turned upside down. And there's just not much more of an appetite for the sort of liberalism that Lyndon Johnson embodied. And so what I see happening from the 1970s onward is that the country's entire political system is moving rightward. So much so that I will tell, when I'm lecturing in the required US history survey class, I'll ask the class at the end of the semester, so who was the last liberal president? And they'll say Obama, or they'll say Clinton, and I'll say, no, Richard Nixon. And I'm doing that in part to be provocative, and in part because I think there's an actual argument to be made that Nixon was the last liberal president, not so much for anything Richard Nixon himself did, but for what the Democratic Congress did when he was in the White House. And I say that to make the point of just how far to the right the entire political system has moved. Not only has the Republican Party become more conservative in the last 40, 50 years, but the entire political system in the United States has moved rightward. And so I think that is important context for the story that you are telling here about the Hispanic Republican that is becoming so important in elections from Richard Nixon onward. I think that there is the specific story of what is going on with Hispanic Republican voters reflects, I think, some larger issues in the American population, and that is a frustration with what voters saw as the failures of the welfare state and the inability of the Democratic Party to merge its older economic liberalism from the New Deal years with the newer identity politics that rose to the fore in the 1960s and the 1970s, so much so that anyone who has any personal experience in Democratic Party politics from the 70s onward knows something about the circular firing squad that too often dominated Democratic politics during that point in time. So I think that those are some issues that are also playing a role in this. And what else was I going to say? I'll make one last point to bring it up to the present, and that speaks to, I think, the frustration that liberals have felt over the last 10, 15 years, going back to Barack Obama's election in 2008, and what happened to the movement that wasn't, I guess, would be a way to put it, because Obama had attracted such a new class of voters and seemed to be offering a new way to look at politics. So what happened? And I think that we can see pretty clearly that Obama in his 2 elections was able to motivate voters to the polls, but while he won 2 elections, he never won the political rhetoric. We are still speaking the political rhetoric that was developed and perfected during the Reagan era. And that is still the language of American politics to this day, with some edits to it that have made it harsher and coarser over, say, the last 4 years, if I may. But we are still living in Reagan's America. And I think that speaks to some issues that you raise in your book. I know I'm not supposed to go on very long, and I've already talked 10, 15 minutes. So time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, it does, and that's great. And Dr. Cadava, I'm gonna, in a moment, I'm gonna ask you to comment on that philosophy, theory, whatever what we want to call it, of the rightward shift as she has outlined it, basically pivoting off a point in time from Johnson, and did Johnson overreach, as she says, and how that would correspond with what we're seeing in terms of the what you refer to as the Hispanic Republican. But to get there, I want to ask this question first, and I'll do a little bit of history with me. You know, all of my adult life, somehow I've been involved in politics, and it's always been said that with the growth of the Hispanic population, the Latino population in Texas, it's destiny that the Democrats are going to win. And that gets said every cycle. Mm-hmm. And then in this cycle, and I'll just use Texas as an example, in Texas, the Hispanic vote was devastating to Biden. If you look at the Rio Grande Valley, you look at specific counties such as Zapata County and Maverick County and Hidalgo, which has been mentioned, Cameron County, the brush country on the way out to El Paso, you can see where Obama and Clinton won by huge double-digit percentages, but it flipped this time and Trump won those. Now, that's a small portion by comparison to some of the urban areas, but it still was devastating to Biden. So I'm going to ask the question this way. When we've always looked at this as when the Latino vote gets to a certain point, when the Hispanic vote gets to a certain point, but what is an Hispanic or a Latino for purposes of describing a Latino or Latina voter? And does that play a role? Are we playing identity politics in a way that doesn't really play out?
Maybe. Yeah, we might be. I mean, and you know, one of the things that's been most interesting to watch in the aftermath of the election, you know, there was the initial surprise about what happened in South Florida and South Texas, and there was the ongoing surprise noting that Trump won a greater share, not only in those places, but pretty much across the map, even in places like Harris County, shifted toward Trump. I mean, Biden still won the Latino vote overwhelmingly, but Trump improved his performance in 2020 compared with 2016, even in urban areas. So those were surprises, but then there developed this whole conversation about like, well, you know, I think people questioned whether they've been kind of sold a false bill of goods when it comes to Latinos, you know, this idea that Latinos are reliable Democrats. Increased Latino participation means better results for Democrats. And because that didn't happen, I think people started to really question the basic assumptions about Latino identity, period. Like, is Hispanic such a thing? Is Latino such a thing? And there were real debates about that. And that was surprising to me. That was genuinely surprising to me because as a Latino historian, I mean, I know that Latinos themselves, ourselves, have always debated Latino identity. What makes us similar? What makes us different? But to see that conversation play out on a national stage and seeing like national media question whether there is even such a thing as Hispanic, that was surprising to me. I didn't anticipate that, you know, I wouldn't have guessed 2 years ago that one of the results of the 2020 election would be a fundamental questioning about Hispanic or Latino identity. Because I think, you know, it has become kind of cliche to say that Latinos are not a monolith. That's one thing. But when people say Latinos are not a monolith, I think what they're usually referring to is the fact that there are Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and Cubans. And so we come from different national groups, but that doesn't say anything about all of the internal diversity within those communities, what the differences are between men and women, citizens, non-citizens, rural dwellers, urban dwellers. There's just so much there, to the point that if you complicate us so much, if you make us so internally differentiated, is there a there at all? And many people were actually making the argument. An op-ed in the New York Times by a woman named Isabel Verde in the days after the election said, you know, we should retire the terms Hispanic or Latino and maybe even Latinx. And I myself, and I'm speaking for her, I myself just see myself as an American. So, you know, there is this question. My point is that the very character of Latino identity came into question after 2020. Somehow, I mean, we've always debated it, but it became pronounced. And the question got asked, well, are Latinos a bloc or are we like swing voters and individual Americans? And part of me thinks that as the population continues to grow, right now we're 60 million Americans, you know, we could be, and that's 20% of the population, maybe we'll be 25, maybe we'll be 30. As our proportion of the US population grows, it's got to be harder and harder to think of Latinos as a bloc, I think, just because, I mean, you don't talk about the white vote, you talk about the suburban voter, you talk about Wisconsin dairy farmers or Rust Belt workers, all of those kinds of things are proxies for like the white vote, but you don't talk about the white vote. So I think it will, this is just my guess, I think it will become harder and harder over time to think of Latinos as a bloc, and that it will become important to reach out to them and approach them like you approach any other Americans. When I've talked about that idea to Latino advocates on the Democratic side, they really don't like that idea because they think there's this idea that, well, there's power in numbers. And from their perspective, in order to get the attention of policymakers on Capitol Hill, there has to be power in numbers, because in order for Latinos to get listened to, we have to show up in force and say, if you don't take us seriously, we're going to not support you or support someone else, something like that. So, you know, I think Democratic advocates for Latinos, and I'm thinking of like Unidos US, Latino Decisions, all of these kinds of advocacy organizations, they really don't like the idea that Latinos aren't a bloc, and a bloc defined by a shared set of beliefs in a whole range of issues. That's one thing. The thing about demographic change and this assumption that you know, increased participation, increased registration, Latino youth registering, naturalizing, whatever, and playing a greater role in American politics, especially in a state like Texas. I think the two main problems are these. The first is that, you know, Latinos just believe different things. So yes, just because there are more, there's greater participation, some of those will become Republicans. It's not like all of that Latino population growth is going to benefit Democrats. And the other thing is that I think it assumes a kind of static Republican Party that's just going to let the wave of demographic change wash over the country without Republicans themselves doing something to think about how to increase their success among Latinos. So I think you can't make the argument that demographic change naturally will benefit Democrats, because the Republican Party will respond to it. It's not like the Republican parties don't know that the country is changing demographically. I mean, whether it will work or not, I think this was the theory behind the appointment of someone like Allen West to be the head of the Republican Party in Texas, that he's going to make an increased effort to bring in new Republicans. And, you know, Greg Abbott has, I think, a Mexican wife and a Mexican mother-in-law. I think that's right.
His mother-in-law has recently passed, but his wife is Latina and his mother-in-law was Latina.
Yeah, and they figured prominently in his campaign ads in, was it 2014, something like that? And, you know, Greg Abbott endorsed a couple of high-profile Latino Republicans for Texas State House races. So Republicans themselves are doing things to try to improve their brand among Republicans, among Hispanics. There's tension there, I think, between what's happening at the state level and the national level. And I think, you know, I interviewed a lot of candidates for the Texas State House before November. And, you know, some of them, depending on their district, a lot of them were in like the suburbs of Dallas. They distanced themselves from Donald Trump because a lot of the voters in their district were not, you know, Trump fans. But then there were, you know, people down in the Rio Grande Valley who talked about the Trump caravans, the car caravans, and really kind of got behind Trump. So anyway, those are some thoughts. And the last thing I'll say about it is, you know, watching Texas in particular, in the weeks leading up to the election, one thing that was so interesting was to, you know, there was just all this talk about early turnout, early voting, shattering records in Harris County, Dallas. And the assumption was always like, oh, that's good for Democrats. That's got to be a really good sign. And, you know, hundreds of thousands more Latinos shattered their participation in 2020 compared to 2016. But there was a huge assumption baked into that reporting that that was going to benefit Democrats. And I think, I haven't like gone deep into this reporting, but I think that that early turnout split was much more evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, maybe because of COVID, maybe because of who knows what, because of how galvanizing of a character Trump is, or how tense the election was overall, who knows why. But that early turnout, it was much more split between Republicans and Democrats than Democrats had hoped.
Well, yeah, and assumed, and you know, it is true that Democrats turned out a bigger vote in Texas than they had done previously. Biden had more votes than what you had seen previously, but it's also true that so did Trump. But let's go back and Dr. Young, you feel free to jump in here, but along the lines of what you just described, and the strategies and the Republican Party does the reaching out, and of course, I want to get into some of the questions about, you know, evangelical voters and the role evangelical religion might play with the Hispanic voter. But before we do that, let's talk about how you just talked about how the Republican Party actually will reach out in order to talk about specific issues. But in this election, how does Trump do what, in your way you look at it, in your theory, how does he do what he was able to do, where on the one hand, he is increasing Hispanic Latino votes, but he's talking about building a wall, he's taking kids from their parents. You know, even in his announcement, he talks in terms of rapists and thieves and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're asking me to explain the inexplicable, and it's really hard. And, you know, this is by far, like, not even close, the main question I always get asked. And I don't know that I've still developed a great answer to it, because it is kind of paradoxical. It doesn't make sense. I can kind of try to explain it to you from the perspective of the Hispanic Republicans I've talked to. The first thing they say is that liberals are obsessed with race, overly obsessed with race, overly obsessed with immigration. Immigration isn't even close to the top issue that we care about. We care much more about jobs, education, healthcare, things like that. So, you know, that's always been true. Latinos have never just been single issue voters, but this is what I mean when I said that since the 1990s that the Republican Party has moved, they've been harder pressed to continue to justify their support for the Republican Party as the Republican Party has moved. But so they're not single issue voters. They don't only care, they don't even care most about immigration. That's one thing they'll say. Another thing they'll say is that they just don't believe, they don't believe that Trump is racist. They think that when they hear those things, they don't believe that he's talking about them for whatever reason, because they, you know, they're citizens, they've been here for a long time, they don't have to worry about it. Another aspect of that, I think, is that, what was I going to say? Something else having to do with, they think that, you know, Democrats just fundamentally misunderstand immigrant ambitions and immigrant motivations. They think that immigrants don't come to the United States to be kind of lumped in with all other Latinos as part of a minority voting bloc. They think that immigrants come to the United States to get ahead, to make better lives for themselves, to create opportunities for their children. I remember one guy telling me like how a lot of the Latino immigrants he was talking to last summer hated seeing all of these statues being torn down across the country because it reminded them of their home countries in Managua and Caracas. And they came to the United States because the United States works. You don't see these kinds of things in the United States. So, you know, whether this is true or not, I'm not saying this is true, right, good. This is what they say as a response to how can you support a president. They also talk about just the economic opportunities of the Trump era. And, you know, say what you will about Trump, it was his presidency was kind of unfolding in this split screen reality where on the one hand, he was doing all of the things you're saying, but ever since 2017, he was out talking about the benefits of his tax cuts for Latino business owners. He himself is an odd representative to go into an evangelical church, but he would send people like Mike Pence to go talk about religious freedoms and his support for charter schools with religious identities, the desirability of blurring religious and public life, all of these things. And he was doing that from 2017. So media didn't cover that very much. The one example I'll give is, over the past summer, when there was that event at the White House, the Hispanic Prosperity Initiative, the whole media coverage focused on the Goya beans thing and boycotting Goya beans. But what that day was about at the White House, from Trump's perspective, it was about announcing more support for Hispanic serving institutions, for charter schools, for new business loans for Hispanic business owners. And that was the takeaway from the people who paid attention to that event. But the media went in this whole other direction about the Goya beans boycott. So I think that's what I mean about like a split screen reality. People were just seeing two different things. I can go on and on, but Nancy, what do you think?
Let me ask, Dr. Young, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, let me just add briefly to that. I think that I think Jerry is right on the different views of Trump, the split screen, if you will, on the Trump presidency. And I think perhaps the best way to understand that, and we can't know this because we can't go back and rerun history for this, I wish we could, but and this is COVID, right? I really wonder, had it not been for COVID, would we be sitting here wondering what the second term of the Trump administration would look like?
It's a very interesting question, and even to the basic part of the way, well, even down to how politics got played, knocking on doors and what who was willing to go and meet voters and do the one-on-one. You're exactly right.
Yeah, because the Democrats had themselves the makings of yet another lovely circular firing squad with about 87 different candidates in the race, right? And it just quickly narrows immediately down to Biden and Sanders. and then just becomes all Biden after South Carolina and Jim Clyburn's raising Biden from the dead. And I don't think Clyburn could have raised Biden from the dead if everyone else hadn't been looking for the exit ramp because of COVID. And I think we would have had a very different election, and might be looking at 4 more years of.
It's an interesting perspective. Dr. Cadava, before I go to the questions from the audience, and we've got a few, I want to, because we are, some of us are in Texas, but because it's Texas, and you brought up George W. Bush and talked about his role, if you run through the history going all the way back to Eisenhower, and then when Republican presidential candidates started getting, over 30%, roughly a third, a little bit more of the Hispanic vote, George W. Bush was, I think, around 40%, and then 44% on re-election. I think I've read or seen where you've said that you thought that George W. Bush was kind of an aberration in all of that. And when I saw that and made a note of it, I thought, I want to ask him why. What's he saying about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think George Bush was an aberration. Well, what I mean by that is that, okay, and during his presidency, Latino Republicans really thought that he would define the future of the party when it came to Latino outreach. They thought that their role and presence within the Republican Party was going to keep increasing with leadership like George W. Bush's. But I think from, if you look at the Republican Party from 1990 to 2020, George W. Bush is, there are lots of other ways we could complicate this when talking about things that aren't about Latinos, but when it comes to Latinos, his presidency is a kind of blip on this radar screen of the past 30 years of the Republican Party. And by that, I mean like this, the kind of thing that Nancy was talking about, and, public tuition for undocumented immigrants and compassionate conservatism. I would also argue that George W. Bush, it wasn't only, a lot of attention was paid to, the fact that he was a border governor and, had tamales for Christmas, those kinds of things, these symbolic gestures. But, I think his family's history is important too, where his father's from Texas, was the head of the RNC, helped establish the Republican National Hispanic Assembly, started courting Latinos in 1980 in Puerto Rico and Texas and California. He's also Jeb Bush's brother. Jeb Bush ran his dad, George H.W. Bush's campaign in Puerto Rico in 1980. He became deeply enmeshed in Florida's Latino community. So my point is, this Bush family had spent decades by the time that George W. Bush became governor in cultivating this Latino support. I mean, he kind of understood, and we know like Jeb's wife, Columba, and George P. Bush, and the quote unquote little brown ones. And so Latinos were part of the Bush family also. So I think the Bush family is kind of unique in this way. And that's what I meant, a blip on the radar screen. And one thing that's interesting is, even if George Bush is a blip on the radar screen, you could still ask the question, well, does his model of recruiting Latinos still point to the future, the potential for future success for Republicans among Latinos? And interestingly, talking to a lot of Latino Republicans after the 2020 election, they very much contrast the way Bush did things with the way Trump did things. And Latino Republicans who support Trump have told me that they see what Bush did as Republican light. Mm-hmm. So they think that the theory under Bush was that the way to reach out to Latinos was through support for comprehensive immigration reform. And if anything, they think Trump is more like Reagan in crafting an ideological appeal. You win Latinos, you win elections by conservative policies, not by catering to the left's support for comprehensive immigration reform.
Good, thank you for that. One of our audience questions says to add a gender lens and then ask a question about machismo having an impact on political partisan identity. Do you think, and Dr. Young, I'll ask this question of you as well, do you think that a show of strength and those sorts of things played a role in a gender politics in the Hispanic community?
What do you think, Nancy?
I am certainly not an expert on Hispanic politics, but I do think from what I've read and just being a way too constant observer of the Trump years, and I say that from the perspective of my blood pressure, right? I think it does. I think it does play a role, and I think that helps explain the differing numbers of percentages of support for Trump from Hispanic men versus Hispanic women, that Latinas were less likely to vote for Trump, and Hispanic men were more likely to vote for Trump. And I think his tough talk appealed, combined with everything else you said, Jerry, about, well, he's not talking about us, he's talking, we're Americans, he's talking about this other.
I think that's right. The only thing I'll add is that, first of all, this is an area that needs a lot more research. And again, I think that I don't know this from my own research, but when talking about this issue, I'd heard from people who have studied the Republican Party that there, in general, wasn't the same kind of gender divide within the Republican Party 30 or 40 years ago. It was more evenly split, like 50% of women would, 50% of a Republican support would come from women, 50% would come from men. Now that's much more skewed. And that's certainly true when it comes to Latinos. And even in 2016, like 2/3 of Trump's Latino support came from men, 1/3 came from women. The reverse was true for Hillary Clinton. 2/3 of her Latino support came from women, 1/3 came from men. So there's no doubt that there's a gender dynamic there. The only thing I would be careful about is whenever I hear explanations for something that have to do with like cultural essentialism, I don't like it. So when, like machismo, for example, to argue that it's—
I'm just reading the question.
Yeah, right. So somehow like the idea that machismo, it makes it sound like it's culturally ingrained in Latino communities to be machismo. And I don't like that. I would want to point to things instead like, the Border Patrol, for example, or police departments are dominated by males and they have masculine work cultures. They also support Republicans. So I would want to look to those kinds of things to explain.
Things like guns in South Texas and in those areas. Yeah.
I would want to look to those kinds of issues for why men support Trump more than women, instead of some sense of like cultural essentialism that men are this way, women are this way.
That's exactly right. And just one more point on the gender gap within the Republican Party. You're exactly right to take it back 40, 50 years, because if you go back to the 1970s, the Republican Party was as committed to women's issues as was the Democratic Party, right? And you have the splitting of the parties on gender issues beginning in the late 70s, early 1980s. And I think that really is an important part of the story as well for female voters who do make their decisions based on where the parties come down on so-called women's issues. There is a disinclination to vote Republican because of the party's lack of support for the Equal Rights Amendment, for abortion rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
If there are any people working on dissertation prospectuses out there in the audience, though, these are good topics. I mean, they need more work.
Well, let's drill down a little bit more on what Dr. Young was just saying, but from a kind of a different angle. And by the way, the audience participant, Dr. Cadava, thanks you for what he refers to as your fascinating research. And he says, could you share your thoughts on the religious right and its appeal to some Hispanic Republicans? Most importantly, the Republican resurgent effort to overturn Roe versus Wade. And I'll kind of add to that in a heavily Catholic culture and issues related to abortion. Talk a little bit about that and the role it's playing.
Yeah. I mean, it's critical. I do think that this is another area that needs a lot more research. I mean, there's some good work out there by a guy, I think at Claremont McKenna, maybe, named Gaston Espinosa, who's written a book called Latino Pentecostals in America. And from Claremont, he kind of runs some opinion polls about evangelical and Catholic communities and how they play out in a partisan sense. So his work is good, but even there's even more work that needs to be done. I have to, just full disclosure, I think that as a historian, and I think this is true of my first book as well, I probably don't pay enough attention to religion as much as I should. In the case of this book, it's for a particular reason. I think in an almost knee-jerk kind of way, whenever I would explain my work to people, the first thing they would say is like, oh, well, surely you're talking about Cuban exiles, or surely you're talking about Catholics. And because they always approached me with like, well, surely you're talking about Catholics, I think that made me, in a kind of contrarian way, want to say like, sure, that's part of it, but there's so much more there. There's all this other stuff. So I think that I paid attention when people like, Catherine Ortega, Reagan's treasurer of the United States, would say things like, I was born a Republican and I'm a Republican because of my deep Catholic faith. I would pay attention to that and I would note that. It's in my book, but I didn't kind of systematically study the partisanship of Catholic Latinos and evangelical Latinos over time. And that would be a really valuable study. And I think it's especially important for evangelicals because, you know, Catholic Latinos in the United States who are Catholics still, I think, are really important within the Catholic Church. They make up probably the single biggest group within the Catholic Church, but evangelical Latinos, that's a faster growing population. And the important thing for Republicans about evangelicals, I think, is that, you know, it's not that all evangelicals are conservative. It's like a 50-50 split. They're swing voters. Half are Democrats, half are Republicans. But 50-50 odds for Republicans among Latinos is much greater odds than it is for Latinos nationally, right? I mean, to go into a church and have a 50-50 chance of recruiting someone's vote or winning someone's vote, that's much better odds than going somewhere else and trying to recruit Latino voters where you're likely to get a third of the votes, something like that. I also think the important thing for evangelicals is that Latino evangelicalism is largely, I think, an immigrant religion. You know, like evangelicalism in Latin America is huge. They migrate to the United States, start evangelical churches. And I think the idea with both parties is that immigrants' political identities aren't fully formed. They're winnable. You can recruit them. And I was talking to the head of the Republican Party in El Paso before the election, and he was saying that he personally showed up at every naturalization ceremony to hand out literature about what the Republican Party stood for. So at the moment of naturalization, Republican Party officials are trying to recruit Latinos. So I think the fact that many Latino evangelicals are recent immigrants is important because the Republican Party believes that they still have a chance to successfully recruit them. So those are kind of some organizational political ideas. Of course, you know, like there's the idea about abortion and faith and things like that. And I think that that's an important narrative that many Latino Republicans talk about. I don't know, maybe I could have studied it in a more focused, systematic way, but like where religion ranks when people go into a ballot box and say, okay, what is the issue that's making me pull the lever for one candidate or another? I don't know where religion ranks, or for any of us. I mean, when any of us go into a ballot box, are we really thinking about one thing, or is it a whole range of things? I don't know how to determine those things, but I don't know. Nancy, do you have any ideas about that?
On that?
Or Kirk?
I think you made very good points there, and there's nothing in particular that I want to add at this point in time, other than to say you've articulated yet more research for prospective dissertation writers.
There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot to be done. I mean, if I could add one more note on that, I mean, I think the more I think about the book that I wrote, and, you know, it feels more and more like a necessary introduction to the topic, because it's an overview from the perspective of the Republican Party and these kind of mutual movements between Republicans and Hispanics and Republicans, but it still operates at the level of the party and national politics. And there needs to be a lot more work that really drills down into local politics. I mean, these questions about gender, religion, those are important, but also, like, I'm still talking about national politics primarily. I'm not talking about like local races in, you know, Houston or Dallas or anywhere. And I think this is just a theory. I don't think, you know, I haven't researched it, but I think the Republican Party at the local and state level has been more successful than at the national level. And I think, you know, Republican Democratic politics at the local level, there's more motion there. You know, I think partisan identities are less rigidly defined at the local and state level than the national level. So I think that's more research that needs to get done.
Well, it's on things like that you've talked about in some specificity, things like private school vouchers. Mm-hmm. Even that specific, yes. When the parties tend to be at the local level tend to be split on whether or not you're going to put money into charter schools, mm-hmm. private school vouchers, things of that nature. And I think the parties sometimes make the dividing line very clear, but the voters are not making it quite so clear.
Oh.
the way you've just described it.
Totally.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I have one appeal, I mean, as an approach to understanding Latino politics, my main appeal would be, you know, in trying to explain, just in this case, let's take Latino Republicans as an example, and trying to understand Latino Republicans, don't only be persuaded by these, what I consider to be oversimplified arguments about, like, oh, it's just aspirational whiteness. Like, all Latinos who are conservative just want to be white. Or it's socialism and fears of socialism. Those explanations might be somewhere in there, but to your point about particular policy issues, I think it's really important to actually pay attention to first of all, take Latinos seriously as political actors. And when they express ideas about charter schools, you can assume that they mean what they say. You know, don't dismiss their support for the Republicans by saying, like, oh, that's just because they want to be white, or it's their white privilege or something like that. Take seriously what they say about charter schools. Now, I think there's probably a conversation to be had about, like, you know, okay, well, how do you distinguish between, like, aspirational whiteness, if you want to call it that, like becoming white? How do you distinguish between that and pursuit of the American dream, which is tied to an issue like education or charter schools? And, you know, Latino families send their kids to charter schools because, for whatever reason, they have concluded that that is the best path for their family's advancement. How do you distinguish between that and aspirational whiteness or something like that? You know, like, to the extent that whiteness is part of the American dream, I don't know. But my plea would be to listen to what Latinos are actually saying about their particular policy preferences and take those statements seriously.
Well, if somebody's asked people for their vote from time to time, I think that's just a good rule anytime, is to take people seriously and ask for their, pay attention to what it is that moves them individually. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I'm really pleased that we were able to have it today. I want to say thank you to both Dr. Nancy Beck Young from the University of Houston and Dr. Geraldo Cadava from Northwestern. Again, his book is The Hispanic Republican, and I've done a little bit of research into it and other things that he has said and written, and it's worth taking the time. And I also think you're both right that those that are watching this and looking for things that they want to do more research on, we've toiled the soil a little bit here today. So I want to say thank you to both of you. I also want to say thank you to the Center for Public History, Monica Perales and Pablo Pinto from the Hobby School of Public Affairs. All of you that are watching, that have participated in this today, thank you, thank you, thank you. And with that, I'll call it a day. Dr. Cadava, Dr. Young, bless you and thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nancy, Kirk, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.